Are you ready to step up your 5th edition game? Well, this is. Oh my gosh! No, this thing is so heavy! This is a review of Level Up! This is Level Up Advanced 5th Edition, the Adventurer's Guide by EN Publishing of 2022. I just got my copy about a month ago or something like that. And Level Up describes itself as an advanced way to play 5th edition. It offers, well, let's see. It offers a unique origin system which allows you to select your heritage, culture, background, and destiny, details of adventuring gear, weapons, armor, vehicles, and strongholds, full rules for combat and adventuring, hundreds of spells, combat maneuvers, exploration knacks, and other exciting abilities, an advanced rule system which adds depth to the core 5th edition rules while maintaining full compatibility. Level Up is a standalone game. Everything you need to create your character and starting adventure can be found in this rulebook. So there we go. Pretty much it for Level Up in a nutshell. This is equated to the player's handbook from Dungeons and Dragons. It is 656 pages, which is ginormous, but it does have everything that you need. So you're going to have things like your character creation, and there's a lot of different things to choose from, which we'll cover in the Origins chapter. Your classes, you'll have things like equipment, multiclassing and feats, ability scores, adventuring. So pretty much everything that you would find in the player's handbook is represented in some way here. There's just a lot of stuff, more stuff to play around with in Level Up. So with that being said, let's get into the introduction chapter. The introduction chapter in Level Up is technically longer than the player's handbook's version, but it still manages to cover about the same amount of information or material. What I find lacking, which the player's handbook does include, and I find to be helpful in some systems, is a using this book section, or as I use it, where to find the thing that I want to read about the most first. While this book is not separated into different parts like the player's handbook is, it would have been nice if they had described, what the 3 books are that you will find in the system. So you actually have the Adventurer's Guide, which is what this review is about, and the Trials and Treasures, which is I guess would be equated to the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then you have the Monster Menagerie, which is your monster manual book. They did give a brief description about the 2 settings that are part of the Level Up system in a way, and that's Zeitgeist, which is like a steampunk version world, kind of much like Eberron, I think, and then you have Burning Skies, which is political with flying ships, much like Eberron in D&D. So there we go. I'm not a really big fan of having core rules in the introduction chapter, or rather, if they are in the introduction section, I wish they would detail them again or expand when necessary in the appropriate chapters. Instead, later on in the book, you'll get references that actually tell you to go back to these pages in the introduction chapter, which means more page flipping. Although they do kind of repeat some of the information like advantage and disadvantage, it's actually repeated with like a couple sentences because, let's be honest, that's all you really need for advantage and disadvantage. But it would have been nice if they had expanded upon, rulings like the expertise system. But oh well. Let's get into character creation. Like many character creation chapters, this one isn't really about creating your character as it is describing the process. And I find myself realizing how much I don't really care for these kinds of chapters the more I read them. Yes, there is information that is absolutely necessary to get across, but this chapter is plagued by like these building varia examples that without mechanical context actually seems really pointless. I will say that this is where the layout for the book really does shine. And I'm going to say this throughout some of these chapters, but in the player's handbook, the text is horrendous and it's like scrunched together. It's like the font is really tiny and my old man eyes have trouble reading it. And In Level Up, the text is spaced out. It's a little bit bigger, like text size is actually bigger, and relevant text is actually either italicized or in bold, which, I mean, is something that you'd find in the player's handbook, but it's just a little bit easier to read here. Make no mistake about it, you're still going to be reading paragraphs and paragraphs of just text, and some of it is just kind of fluff. So, the first step in creating your character is to detail their origins. Now, your origins are actually separated into four different aspects. You have heritage, culture, your background, and destiny. And we'll take a look at that in the next chapter. Heritage, though, deals with who your biological parents are. Culture describes where you grew up in the world and the people you grew up around. Background helps outline the journey you took to get to this point, and I always tend to think of it as your occupation before you started adventuring. Destiny is the overarching goal of your character, and the mechanical benefits they bring are actually new in Level Up. Once you set up your origin, you'll choose a class. For the most part, all the classes from the player's handbook are represented here with major changes. Next, you'll determine their ability scores, and it's the exact same thing from Dungeons & Dragons. You have 6 abilities, and the modifiers are completely the same. With ability scores set, you can determine your AC, your defense, your HP, your saves, and all of that, your derivative stats. Your gear is actually partly determined by the class you take and some backgrounds. You can actually get some equipment from your backgrounds as well. I actually like this option because there are all sorts of equipment packages to choose from, and it does vary from class to class and from all the different backgrounds as well. So you might play as a berserker with a friend, and you might choose different equipment loadouts. You actually have options in the equipment loadouts that you could choose from. I've already mentioned that the ability modifiers are the same, but anything that is mathematically mechanical to the game is actually going to stay the same. So proficiency bonuses and XP are all going to be the same, but I mean that's part of the core system for 5th edition, so you can't really fudge or change that a whole lot. Next, let's take an in-depth look at the origins. I can see why they've lumped heritage, culture, background, and destiny into one chapter, but I really wish they would have given the page numbers at the beginning of the chapter. Then again, the table of contents does a very nice job in showing you where everything is, with the exception of backgrounds. That font is definitely smaller. No longer are you relegated to race and background for ability bonuses and some features. These are spread into heritage, which is kind of your race, your culture, where you grew up and around who, your background, and destiny. So let's take a look at heritages. There are 9 different heritages to choose from, same as in the player's handbook. Although there are some slight changes. Half-orcs have been changed to orcs, and tieflings are now plain touched. And this also encompasses the Aasimar, if I'm not mistaken. For the most part, the heritages are still representative of what you would find in the player's handbook. Your Dragonborn, they're still going to have dragon breath and, the different ancestries like chromatic, metallic, and things like that. So it's kind of similar. Instead of having sub-races, though, each heritage has a few different gifts offered to them at the character creation. For example, the Dragonborn have access to draconic armor, which gives you claws, resistances, and scales, or you can take draconic fins, which allows you to swim, see in the dark, and more scales. Or you could take the draconic wings, which gives you wings and allow you to fly. In addition, each heritage has some paragon features, which you acquire at 10th level. For example, for the Dragonborn, you can get impenetrable draconic armor, the mighty draconic wings, and the sleek draconic fin. So depending on which of the gifts you've chosen will determine which of the paragons you actually get. And there is a little blurb about, the culture for each heritage and some suggested cultures that just kind of make sense a little bit. if you want to play more of a traditional character. So for your actual heritages, like I've said, you have Dragonborn, you have Dwarf, Elf, Gnome, Halfling, my favorite OP, Human, Orc, Plain Touched, which are Tieflings and Aasimar. Yes. So, culture. Culture answers the age-old question, what if I'm a dwarf who's raised by elves? Well, all jesting aside, the culture you grew up in represents how you were raised and the people that you were around. This helps settle some stereotypes that have become associated with certain races over the years, and in a mechanical sense, it adds some variety and options for role-playing. Does it solve the problem that D&D finds itself in representation, stereotyping, and racial essentialism? Not really, but it is a step in the right direction, in my opinion. So there are a whopping 35 different cultures to choose from. Each culture gives you several features that your character have learned over the years, as well as a language or two. The cultures are Caravaner, Circus Folk, Collegiate, Cosmopolitan, Deep Dwarf, Deep Gnome, Dragonbound, Dragon Cult, Eladrin, Forest Gnome, Forgotten Folks, Forsaken, Godbound, High Elf, Hill Dwarf, Imperial, Itinerant, Kitbane Halfling, Lone Wanderer, Mountain Dwarf, Mustbairn Halfling, Nomad, Settler, Shadow Elf, Steamforged, Stoic Orc, Stoneworthy, Stout Halfling, Tinker Gnome, Tunnel Halfling, Tyrannize, Villager, Warhordling, and Wildling, and then last but not least, the Wood Elf. So quite a lot to go through there. Your background is what you did before you became an adventurer, as I like to say, your job. And this time there are 23 backgrounds to choose from. Now each background gives you 2 ability score increases, usually a set one, and then one that you get to choose. They'll also give you some skill proficiencies, languages or tool proficiencies, and more features. You can also have connections or an NPC that you deal with in the past and some sort of a memento. These are pretty neat and help flesh out your background even more, although if you play with people who love to fill out pages and pages of backstory, this might seem limiting in a way, but it could also give some ideas. Of course, you're free to choose or make up your own if you so wish. And for your backgrounds, you have Acolyte, Artisan, Charlatan, Criminal, Cultist, Entertainer, Exile, Farmer, Folk Hero, Gambler, Guard, Guild Member, Hermit, Marauder, Noble, Outlander, Sage, Sailor, Soldier, Trader, and the Urchin. Always last, the Urchin. The last part of this chapter is your destiny. This is kind of what your overarching goal or that thing that motivates you to do what you do. And there are 10 destinies to choose from. You have Chaos, the Coming of Age, Devotion, Dominion, Excellence, Knowledge, Metamorphosis, Revenge, Underdog, and Wealth. To me, your destiny serves 2 purposes. It gives you inspiration, that resource that you could spend to gain advantage for a single role, and it also sets up your character's personality in a way. Each destiny has 2 features. One for your inspiration, that's how you gain inspiration, and one for when you fulfill your destiny. And some of them are uber powerful, like, Miraculous Revival, which allows you to come back from the dead within 24 hours after you die, provided that you sacrifice yourself for something that you care about. So that's a lot to take in. And one of the benefits of using Level Up is that your players have access to all sorts of options to flesh out the characters the way that they want to play it. It's also a lot of features to keep track of. But we're not done yet. Let's take a look at the adventuring classes. There are 13 classes in Level Up, and they all reflect what you'll find in Dungeons & Dragons minus anything that's come out recently, such as the Artificer. The Martial class is the only class that doesn't seem to have any parallels with any of the classes in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and some classes, such as the Adept and the Berserker, are just renames. Now, I actually did get a comment this morning about the Martial class, and apparently it's the same as the one of the 4th edition classes, one of the leader classes. And so I actually did not think to look in 4th edition for any references that might have come up in this. But that is actually really cool. But I still have my problems with the martial class. But anyways, we'll get into that in time. So the biggest change in terms of how classes function is just the amount of choices players have. You still have an archetype, which is chosen at around 3rd level, 2nd level for some, but there are a host of other features to choose from just by gaining levels in the chosen class. You and a buddy can both play as a monk-type character and still have different features and function differently. There is no better example in this regard than the martial classes. So your examples are your adept, fighter, rangers, etc. They have access to combat maneuvers. There are basic maneuvers, and there are maneuver-specific disciplines. All martial classes now have what is called an exertion pool, which is what Kai is to monks in Dungeons & Dragons. It's a spendable resource that allows you to use one, or a few, for these maneuvers. And there are over 100 combat maneuvers to choose from, and we'll get into that chapter much later in the book. The Adept is the monk class from Dungeons & Dragons. You gain exertion points starting at 2nd level, at which you can start using combat maneuvers. Unfortunately, you won't be slinging kamehamehas or casting spells. This is strictly a martial arts centered class, although you do gain a plethora of features and techniques to use. The Bard is your jack of all trade type of a class, as in Dungeons & Dragons. I like that the Bard isn't relegated to just music making. They actually have these art specialties like percussion, string instruments, visual, which encompasses calligraphy, dance, light manipulation, and shapes, voice, and wind instruments. And they each give you different features or bonuses, and you can actually switch to between them after you finish a short or a long rest. And that's pretty handy. The Berserker is the Barbarian, complete with rage capabilities. And by the way, rage is kind of a little overpowered in this iteration. Not only do you have access to combat maneuvers, but your rage actually gives you temporary hit points every turn that you are in rage, which is actually pretty ballin'. Archetypes for the Berserker allow you to don heavy armor and still rage, make it harder to die while under the effects of rage, or harness the power of thunder while you are raging. Clerics in Level Up kind of suffer from a lack of versatility that was had in Dungeons & Dragons. Your archetype gives you your bonus spells, and they are relegated to Healer, Oracle, Sun Priest, or the War Priest. You're no longer going to gain bonus spells depending on who your god is, so you might have like a Trickster Cleric for some reason. You're not going to have any of that this time. The Cleric is a little bit more focused in a way, so you're also getting rid of some of that versatility, which for some can be limiting, but let's be honest, as a cleric, you're probably going to be healing most of the time anyways. Something that I'm going to point out here, because the cleric is the first spellcasting class that we've had so far, at the end of spellcasting classes, you're going to have the spell list. So no longer do you have to flip all the way to the back of the book to find your class and all the spells that you can cast. It's actually at the end of that specific class, and there's actually a little brief description of what those spells do, which is very handy. Druids, for the most part, are very similar to their D&D counterpart. You can still wild shape and cast spells. Instead of acquiring bonus spells depending on your favorite terrain, if you choose Circle of the Land from Dungeons & Dragons, you get features called Secrets of Nature starting at 1st level. Fighters are now actually somewhat relevant. While other martial classes along with the fighter get their extra attack at 5th level, the fighter gets an additional extra attack at 11th level. and they still have fighting styles, but combined with combat maneuvers, they are a force to be reckoned with. It's just more and more options for fighters this time around. The Herald is the Paladin. You get spells right from the get-go at level 1, and depending on the archetype you associate with, you'll get some bonus spells, same as Dungeons & Dragons. They do have access to combat maneuvers, but this is one of those classes that doesn't really offer anything too different from its D&D counterpart. The Marshal is the tactical leader class, and this is the class that confuses me the most because it seems like it could have been an archetype for the fighter class in some respects. You do get a stronghold at 13th level though, and you get a supreme stronghold at 20th level. Rangers are still your expert hunters with familiar terrain and favorite enemies. Unfortunately, they gain spells a level later than their D&D counterpart, and that's only if you choose the Wildling archetype. The Beastmaster archetype gives you more in terms of an animal companion, but you can just as easily get a beast companion by taking the beast friend Knack. The Warden archetype gives you access to a mount that you can actually ride around and hit things from. The Rogue, for all its intents and purposes, functions very similar to its D&D counterpart, although there are just more options to kind of round him out as a jack of some trades style. The archetypes are much to be desired here. For example, when I think of a burglar, I think of a thief, not someone who excels at backstabbing like an assassin or a cutthroat. Yet they have access to the backstab feature, which allows you to roll d8s instead of d6s for sneak attack. Sorcerers are functionally the same, although there are more options for metamagic this time around. Draw Nourishment. Let's take a look at that real quick, because that is one that really bothered me when I first read this. You can consume things that most people wouldn't consider sustenance, though it's hardly pleasant. You can spend 3 sorcery points before eating a pound of just about anything organic. Bark, grass, cactus, flesh, bone, whatever's at hand. And as long as you can stomach the taste, it counts as 1 supply for you as your body transmutes it into something more edible. A poisonous substance consumed in this way is still poisonous. That to me just thematically doesn't fit very well with the sorcerer. Now, they did kind of fluff it up a little bit where you have to spend some sorcery points and like your body magically changes the stuff inside your stomach, but to me that just seems like it could have been fit very well with a druid or even the ranger class. The archetypes for the sorcerer are also kind of lackluster. Like you have the draconist, which is probably one of the better ones, the enigma, and then the traveler. Yeah, not so much going on here. The Warlock is another class that suffers from the mechanically the same, just different stuff syndrome. The patron you form a pact with doesn't give you unique bonuses or spells, as that is now tied to your archetype. I do like Eldritch Blast and how it actually performs a little bit differently, like you get different weapons, like you can have an actual ray and scythe or a whip that drains HP from an enemy. That's actually pretty cool. Then there's the Wizard, the OP spellcasting class of them all. They still have arcane recovery, and they still have knowledge of the school of their choice, which has been kind of expanded by the way, but they also have archetypes. The Arcanist is your traditional gone-to-school wizard. The Mage is your dropped-out-of-high-school type of wizard. Then there's the Pyromancer, who at 2nd level has the ability to heal any one creature with a fire spell. Now think about that for a second. You can cast Fireball at 5th level, but if the fighter's in melee with a group of enemies, now you can actually have your cake and eat it. The fire gets healed by however many d6s Fireball does, while dealing damage to anything that doesn't speak friend to enter. Also, they can make demands of gods at level 14. So, yeah. Some of the classes do a great job at changing things up, like any of the martial classes. But there are some that make very few changes or just seem kind of lackluster. See, Sorcerer. Every class has more stuff. Some of it is good, some of it's misplaced, some of it just doesn't belong. And this kind of reminds me of Pathfinder 2nd Edition in a lot of ways, of just offering players lots of options and just seeing what sticks. If you have players looking for something different, something that they can min-max with, or just have some players who want to play the same class, then this is actually a pretty solid way of doing it, because even if you play as the same class as somebody else, you're still going to have different options. You might choose different options or different features or combat maneuvers and things like that. you won't find yourself going down a linear rabbit hole of choices as 5th edition does with its classes before picking an archetype. For now, let's take a look at equipment. Equipment in Level Up is similar to what you'd find in Dungeons & Dragons. Instead of splitting weapons into 2 categories, simple and martial, the weapons in Level Up are separated by their damage die. I'm not exactly a big fan of this, but it does prevent the table from being overcrowded with information. So you'll have all your D4 items here, D6s, D8s, D10s, the D12, and then the 2D6. And then you have your ranged weapons that are sorted similar. Also, some weapons now deal bonus damage to certain materials. For example, the hand axe actually has the breaker wood property, so it actually deals more damage to anything that's made of wood, like a wooden door or a tree. There are some cultural weapons this time around and some rare weapons like the Assassin's Gauntlet or the Boot Dagger, which is pretty interesting. And there are also some ammunition types, which is actually pretty cool. Shields are interesting this time around. Not only do they give you a flat up AC bonus, as is always done, but now you can actually sacrifice your shield to withstand a critical attack against you. And instead of receiving a critical attack, it just bumps it down to regular damage. So if you actually get a critical attack against you, you sacrifice your shield, it's now broken, and you just suffer normal damage as normal. Armor now requires maintenance. There are only 2 states of damage. You have damaged or broken. And if the armor is broken, it provides half of its bonus to your AC. Medicine is also greatly expanded here, and it's actually really cool because this is something that I've always wanted to do in my fantasy type games. So you have different items that can heal different aspects of your character. For example, the bandage. These strips of sterilized cloth staunch bleeding and cover wounds. You can use an action to apply a bandage to yourself or another creature to end ongoing piercing or slashing damage. When using improvised bandages, there's a 50% chance of exposure to a disease. Or laudanum. This mixture of ambergris, saffron, and other rare ingredients can calm the nerves and ease mental pain. When you drink the bitter reddish-brown concoction in this vial, you recover a level of strife. Roll 1d10. On a 1, you gain a short-term mental stress effect. Once a creature benefits from laudanum, you cannot do so again until it finishes a long rest. Strife is something that we're going to see much later in this book, as well as mental stress and the different conditions that you can get. Equipment packs also make a return in Level Up. The Assassins Pack, Demolitions Pack, and Pirates Pack are new this time around, but everything else is just the same from its Player's Handbook counterpart. Mounts and vehicles have been expanded just a little bit in terms of choices and features offered. I particularly like that when your vehicle is reduced to half HP, it actually sustains some sort of a malfunction, and you just roll a d6 and consult the chart for that. Spellcasting services have also been explained, and there's actually a nice table of different spells and how much they cost and things like that, and the class that person has to be in order to do that. And then there's the stronghold section. If your players so choose, they could acquire or build a stronghold. And this part of the chapter, I feel, could have been its own chapter. The rules are very detailed without being overly complex, like in Spectacular Settlements. There are a variety of strongholds to choose from, such as castle, workshop, menagerie, sacred grove, temple, encampment, farm, training hall, guild house, shop, house, tavern, laboratory, and library. And each one actually provides its own benefits and features. If you don't want to go through the process of building one, there are some examples already made that you can just take and plug in and play with. And with strongholds may also come followers, people that you can recruit. They come in 3 varieties: inexperienced, seasoned, and expert. And the cost to hire them increases as does the bonus or features they grant. You'll have followers such as the apothecary, bodyguard, cook, the diviner, footpad, healer, interpreter, minstrel, porter, sage, smith, squire, teamster and the torchbearer, for when you need to go down the deep, dark rabbit hole and nobody wants to sacrifice an arm to carry the torch. Yeah, that's that person. Much of the information in the equipment chapter has been carried over from the player's handbook. Again, there's just more stuff. Although the addition of strongholds and the expansion of followers is actually greatly appreciated. For now, let's take a look at multiclassing and feats. The multiclassing section is the same as Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, although they did add Arcana to the Sorcerer and the Wizard's proficiencies gained, which actually kind of makes sense. Since combat maneuvers are new, there are some rules on how many exertion points to get. If you gain the combat maneuvers class feature from more than one class, you gain any additional combat traditions or maneuvers the features provide, but your exertion pool remains the same and does not stack. Heralds are an exception to this rule. If your first levels are in the Herald class, you gain an exertion pool equal to twice your proficiency bonus. You regain exertion spent from this pool at the end of a short or long rest. Now, whereas you have 42 feats in the player's handbook, there are about 91 feats in Level Up. Now, you still have your staples such as Alert, which is now called Attentive, but there are some new types of feats that make use of multiclassing to gain new features. The Blade Chant is actually one of them, and Blade Chant would be like level 1, you would get this feature as soon as you can, and then later on you can get the Rolling Incanter, and then after that you could get the Eldritch Whirlwind Master. And there's actually a few of these sets spread out throughout the feats chapter, which are actually pretty cool. It makes multiclassing a little bit more interesting in my opinion. Although, let's be honest, the way that Dungeons & Dragons have gone now is that some of the archetypes already kind of seem like multiclassing. Another series of interesting feats are the ones that actually turn you into a vampire or a revenant. Let's see. So yeah, you must have been bitten by a vampire or taken necrotic damage equal to quadruple your level from a single attack or spell. This is another one of those multi-level feats. You take New Blood and then Vampire Spawn and then Vampire Lord. And it's the same with the Revenant. Yeah, let's see. So you have Revenant, Vendetta, one other feat or previous ability score improvement, you must be dead. And then you have True Revenant, and then that's it. Okay, so True Revenant is just a twofer right there. More options for customization is the name of the game here. Some of the added features are very interesting, and some are very situational or lackluster. But then again, Dungeons & Dragons suffers from the same. For now, let's take a look at ability scores. Considering this is part of the core rules for 5th edition, everything is mostly the same here. However, I think that the Player's Handbook kind of does things a little bit better. My main critique is that the Player's Handbook actually associates the skills with the attributes right up front. And here in Level Up, you get a list of, what you can use that specific ability for. For example, for strength, forcing a stuck or locked door, bursting out of bonds, tearing a thick book in half, squeezing into a tunnel that is too small, things like that. It doesn't actually associate any skills with that, or at least not up front. Later on, you'll find the skills, and they kind of give you those associations, but not here. This chapter also made me aware of how information is presented, or a lack thereof. I mentioned this before in the introduction section of this video, but the core rules are kept within that basic chapter, the introduction chapter. You'll see things like advantage and disadvantage here, but it's a paragraph that ends with see such and such page for more details. Group checks also do this wherever that's at. While advantage and disadvantage does explain what the terms mean, because let's be honest, it's not that hard of a concept to grasp, it would have been nice if they had expanded it like they did earlier in the book, or even included the expertise system, because it just says these terms are covered in detail on page 11. It doesn't even really explain the expertise die here. The last part of the chapter is all about the skills. You get a nice detail of skills, but also the specialties that apply. For example, sleight of hand, you might have specialties such as distraction, pickpocketing, and legerdemain. This is where rolling the expertise die comes into play. My favorite aspect of this section by far are the critical successes and critical failures. And now you can actually roll a d6 and consult the chart. For example, arcane. For your critical success, you might have an arcane surge. Comfort in the arcane. You may take 10 on an arcana check for the next 24 hours, even if it is not normally allowed. You might have an expanded use, a free use, lucky magic, or meta magic use. For critical failure, you might have an arcane feedback where you take 1 point of damage per spell level. You might have a break device, a delayed activation, misaligned aiming, unlucky magic, or just wasteful usage where nothing happens and you wasted a charge of that item. It should be worth mentioning that this section is categorized a little bit differently. So you have arcane, you have facts and discoveries, you have medicine skills, physical skills, and social skills. The layout of this book really does shine in this chapter, with the exception of the list of skills, which is just a wall of text. The critical success and failure charts are very well done and make skills a little bit more interesting. For now, let's take a look at adventuring. This is, for better or worse, a copy of the adventuring chapter in the player's handbook. Downtime activities are slightly expanded here. The most notable difference is the addition of spellcasting, which is creating new and rare types of spells. These are just modifications to your existing spells, which can be cool if you have the time to do so. Remember, downtime activities for some of these crafting take weeks and weeks to actually make use of. The only other addition is the character's prestige rating. Simply put, a prestige rating dictates how many followers you can have, and it can also be used to call in some favors from some political figures. It's pretty much your reputation and whether or not people are going to recognize you. There's really not a whole lot to say on this chapter. The addition of spellcasting should especially be fun for spellcasters who like to min-max. But these downtime activities, as I've said, are really dependent on the type of game that you're playing, if it supports it. If you actually have downtime activities, if you actually have those moments in your campaign or adventures where your players can actually rest up, heal, and do these types of crafting things. For now, let's take a look at combat and turn-based action. This is another chapter where the layout really does shine. The information presented isn't scrunched together. It's actually very easy to read, and there are bullet points where applicable. The information is the same. It has to be since it's core to the system, but there are some additions. There are some additional rules for mounted combat. A creature can ride on top of another creature at least one size larger than its own, provided the bigger creature can support its weight. Mounting or dismounting a creature costs half your movement and can be performed once per turn. You have half cover. You have advantage on ability checks to leap off the creature you're riding. If you are knocked prone, you make a DC 10 dexterity check throw, or dexterity saving throw, or fall off prone in a space adjacent to the creature you're riding. If the creature you're riding is knocked prone, you can use your reaction to dismount and land on your feet. Otherwise, you fall prone. While you are being ridden by another creature, you have advantage on ability checks to throw the creature riding you. There's also more emphasis on tactical positioning. You still have flanking, but now you have things like attacking from above or being back to back with an ally. You can even drag an ally. And now you can actually pull an enemy from below. So like if you're prone next to an enemy, you can actually pull them down to the ground, which is actually pretty cool. The actions are the same, but there's actually one addition, and it's called Press the Attack. Before you take the attack action, you can use a bonus action to designate one creature within your reach, which is not currently the target of a Press the Attack action. Until the beginning of your next turn, your melee attacks against that creature gain an expertise die, and all attacks against you are made with advantage. You cannot gain expertise dice in this way on attacks made with disadvantage. When you press the attack, your target can use its reaction to fall back. So exhaustion is now fatigue, and you can get this condition if you fall unconscious during an encounter, you take a critical hit while at 0 HP, or by blocking a critical hit and turning it into a regular hit. You can only do that last one once before needing to take a short or long rest. The fatigue track is also different, but you'll have to check the appendix for that. There's actually a bit of a discrepancy here. In this paragraph, a creature can survive multiple such injuries and continue adventuring. However, injuries are not to be ignored lightly. If you gain 5 levels of fatigue, you are doomed to die, as your combined injuries mean you're beyond the aid of all but the most powerful healing magics. But in the appendix, it states that you have to be at 7 levels of fatigue before you are doomed. And there are only 7 levels, so at the very last level of fatigue, you are doomed to die. Doom, by the way, means your character is actually going to die, usually succumbing to their injuries in a couple of hours. Even when you die, you still have the doomed condition, and only a resurrection, true resurrection, or wish can remove that condition. There are some pretty cool environmental effects to spice up combat too, which is actually very cool. I kind of wish they had included like some sort of a weather effects chart in the adventures chapter, but oh well. Last but not least, Level Up tries to introduce a countdown system by using a pool of d6s. You take your pool, you roll them, and any dice that roll a 6 are taken away. When you run out of dice, your time is up. You can change the countdown rate by increasing the range needed to remove the dice, either 5 to 6 or 4 to 6. But I find this system a little messy. I prefer something akin to Blades in the Dark, where you set up a countdown clock and every turn it just goes down by 1 until the PCs influence the environment in some way or succeed in the encounter. This is another great chapter that really does showcase the layout of this book. And I actually like the change from exhaustion to fatigue. The disadvantages don't start until level 2 fatigue, by the way. It's easier to get fatigue though, so you'll have to watch out. In a way, this actually encourages staying in a safe haven for an extended period of time because your fatigue level decreases by 1 every time you take a long rest. So if you have 3 levels of fatigue, you need to spend 3 days at a safe haven before you're back to 0. And if you're spending time at a safe haven, that means you're also spending some time with those downtime activities. For now, let's take a look at combat maneuvers. This is an in-depth explanation of combat maneuvers and the use of exertion points. Much of the information was already explained in your class selection if your class uses combat maneuvers. You now have a maneuver DC, which equals 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus your strength or dexterity modifier. By the way, they're also non-magical. This functions very similar to combat maneuver bonuses and combat maneuver defense from Pathfinder, and some combat maneuvers do require the target to make a save or else suffer its effect. Every class has access to these basic maneuvers. They do not use exertion points, and they include things like disarming. You can grab on, grapple, knock down, overrun, or shove. Very simple and basic things. Then you have all of these combat maneuvers, and actually your basic maneuvers are also in here as well. So yeah, pages upon pages of just combat maneuvers. As you can see, there are a lot of combat maneuvers. There's actually over 100. I actually lost count like at 120 or something like that. There are different styles from which you can choose your combat maneuvers from. For example, you have the Adamant Mountain Maneuvers. Engaging in combat means enduring some amount of suffering, and those who make use of Adamant Mounters maneuvers are well prepared to weather their opponent's blows, relying not just on their might, but the careful and expertise application of force in all aspects of battle. You have the Biting Zephyr Maneuvers. Not every battle requires making close contact with the enemy, and there is an art to fighting from a distance, whether that be a few dozen feet or hundreds. Warriors that know Biting Zephyr techniques are superlative ranged combatants, not only for the deadly accuracy of their attacks, but also the myriad tricks they've mastered to routinely make shots that should be impossible. Then you have Mirror's Glint maneuvers. At its heart, combat is a dance between opponents, and practicing the Mirror's Glint tradition means reading, interpreting, and anticipating one's foe. Using instinct and your insight from battles won and lost, you are excellent at reacting to an enemy in order to gain the upper hand. Mist and shade maneuvers. Making the wrong move in a fight can be fatal, particularly when an opponent causes such a misstep. Warriors that rely on mist and shade maneuvers are confounding foes that play mental games amidst battle, feinting and leading their enemies into crucial mistakes that are all too ready to exploit. Rapid current maneuvers. It is not always the hardest hits that win a fight. Sometimes striking first is far more important. Embracing rapid blows and agility, warriors of the rapid current tradition know how to use speed to its utmost to defeat a foe. Then you have Razor's Edge maneuvers. The most impressive strikes and superlative parries are not matters of luck or circumstance when made by a warrior utilizing the Razor's Edge. They are the fruits of keen awareness, concentration, and ironclad discipline. The Sanguine Knot maneuvers. A battle fought alone is often a battle already lost, and practitioners of the Sanguine Knot tradition focus on the opportunities presented when an ally is nearby to help. When they may be weaker alone, these warriors are lethal in tandem, and the trust they have for their companions make them truly valuable adventurers to keep nearby. Spirited Steed maneuvers. There are many warriors that fight on horseback or an altogether different kind of creature and master the tricks of battling in tandem with their mount or to overwhelm slower, less mobile foes. The most common adherents to this tradition are soldiers typically born to noble castes with the resources to both keep steeds and pay for the tutelage of their use. Tempered Iron maneuvers. To achieve victory over any opponent, a warrior must be confident, and those who utilize the techniques of tempered iron are certain of their every step and swing, often zealous in their pursuit of a foe and motivated by a daunting drive to succeed no matter the cost. The Tooth and Claw maneuvers. There is a fundamental need to survive that all creatures tap into during a fight, an urge to endure that can be captured and focused to tremendous effect. Wielders of Tooth and Claw are animalistic in their attacks, moving around in combat and pouncing upon an opponent's every weakness. Unending Wheel maneuvers. There are many facets to combat. How one places their feet, an adroit grip upon a weapon's hilt, the angle of a shield arm. But achieving exceptional skill over a specific weaponry can be an efficient means to victory. By patiently focusing your martial skills, you unlock secrets that general practitioners of combat never glean, and with dedicated training, you master their use. Combat maneuvers are a great expansion to the 5e system that really makes the martial classes outstanding. Are all of the combat maneuvers relevant? No, but there are a lot of different options to choose from. So even if you and another player have a fighter, you're still more likely to have builds that can excel at different things. For now, let's take a look at spellcasting. This chapter is very similar to the Player's Handbook's chapter on spellcasting. The one thing that is missing that I really kind of wish was here is an area of effect chart. The Player's Handbook's version of it was horrible, but at least it had one. Something else that is missing from this chapter is a list of spells broken down by spellcasting classes. As I've said earlier, they move that to the end of each spellcasting class, and they provide a brief description of those spells. It is so much easier having everything in one place, as opposed to having to flip all the way back to this chapter, which isn't quite all the way to the end of the book, so that would have been an even bigger chore. I much prefer where it is at the end of the classes. You still have your classical spell schools like abjuration, conjuration, divination, enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation, but now you have other spell schools. These are just like tags that kind of briefly describe the specific spells, and these are things like beasts, chaos, fear, fire, protection, poison, plants, weather, just little tags that briefly describe, spells. Spellcasters who can summon now can actually reduce the time it takes to summon by using rapid summoning. The spellcaster concentrates for 1d4 plus 1 rounds, and the spell lasts for about 1 minute. The spell list is simply too long for me to read through, and it is a very long list. There are some new additions, and some of the spells have been renamed, most notably any spells from the player's handbook that has a named character in it. Some of the spells in Level Up also have a rare variant that your players may come across and learn, and these are just beefed up versions of those spells. For example, we have Acid Arrow. It actually has 2 rare spells. So you have Gabal's Blinding Acid Arrow. The arrow flies to the target's sensory organ, seeking to damage its sight. A creature damaged by the spell makes a dexterity saving throw, or it is blinded until the end of its next turn. And then you have Krevin's Insidious Acid Arrow. The acid stinks and disorients as it burns. A creature damaged by this spell makes a Constitution saving throw with advantage, or it is poisoned until the end of its next turn. And these are just versions of a spell that have, like, you would have created in your spell crafting if you have that feature, or if you do that downtime activity. So there's a ton of spells. I think probably more in Level Up than in the player's handbook, which is cool. I mean, I'm not going to beat it over the bush. There's just more options. And especially with rare spells being a thing in this book, there's just more and more things to do as a spellcaster, which is always beneficial. Let's take a look at the appendix. Appendix A is all about conditions. Quite honestly, I kind of miss the goofy illustrations that we got in the player's handbook. There are more conditions here than in the player's handbook, but the one that baffles me the most is bloodied. A creature is bloodied when reduced to half its hit points or less, and they kind of really miss an opportunity to actually do something with that condition other than just it being a descriptor. The rules for fatigue are also here, although you pretty much got a better explanation earlier in the book. Something that wasn't mentioned before that I kind of wish was mentioned somewhere earlier in the book is strife. This goes along with fatigue, and the PCs can accrue strife. The narrator can dish out short-term mental stress effects, which usually last 1d6 days, but when you reach level 6 or 7 of strife, you get a long-term mental effect, and there are some descriptions of what those effects actually do. Appendix B is all about the gods, the faiths, and the beliefs. There are some sample gods here, but it is really implied that you as the narrator will create your own pantheon or just use one from another source. Appendix C is all about beasts and creatures, and these are just simple creatures that you would expect to find in the player's handbook. I actually think there is probably less of them here than that you'd find in the player's handbook. And Appendix D is about compatibility with original 5th edition and Level Up. So, put simply, this book claims that it has full compatibility. And yes and no. You're going to have to do the work if you want to take something from original 5th edition, like an adventure or something, and if there's a monster that's not represented in the monstrous menagerie that you want to bring into Level Up, then you're going to have to do a little bit of work. Mainly the maneuver DC, which is pretty easy. It's just 8 plus proficiency bonus plus dex or strength modifier. I do appreciate that there's a compatibility name table. So like it says that the Aasimar are now the plain touched, as are the Tieflings. And it just has a list of terms that have things changed. Is this fully compatible with 5th edition though? There are some things that don't. Mainly races and classes. If you take that out, then yes, because at its core it is still 5th edition, so the math is still got to be the same, right? But other than that, yes, it is fairly compatible. I would be confident in saying that you can take adventures or monsters or NPCs and transfer them over to level up. It's core 5e, so it should be compatible. You just have to do a little bit of um, additional work to actually make it work. So let's move on to my final thoughts. In my review, I like to categorize my final thoughts into 4 different categories: core gameplay, artwork, layout, and content. Core gameplay. If you enjoy playing 5e, then the core gameplay is still here. It's advanced 5e, not a new system. This is clearly for people who have experience with 5th edition already. I would not give this to completely new players because the amount of options and changes to character creation, there's just a lot of stuff to keep track of that could put some people off from role playing in general. While there are flaws within the 5e system itself, Level Up tries to fix some with various degrees of success. The addition of the expertise die is welcome, as it seems to be a growing trend in tabletop RPGs as of late. The addition of strife and the slight update to exhaustion, which is now fatigue, is also welcome. Changes to race or heritage, as it is known in Level Up, is a step in the right direction, and you can tell that a lot of care and thought has been put into its design. The addition of combat maneuvers breathes fresh air into the martial classes. Does it fix everything or address certain issues from Dungeons and Dragons? No, but that is also a very tall order to fix, and quite honestly, may not have a solution in 5th edition's overall design. But for this, I will give core gameplay a success. Artwork. Having so many different artists work on this book, you'd expect a mixed bag of sorts, but it's not so much the case here. Everything is consistent. I don't even mind the 3D looking character models that you find in some of the pages for the different classes. They actually kind of remind me of Hero Forge in a way. Some of them do look a little goofy, like that Orc Bard on page 125, but it's still well done. I do miss having art for different items and weapons and armor. Even the B section has very little bit of it, although to be fair, there really isn't much in Appendix C. For this, I'm still going to give a success. The layout for Level Up is a huge improvement over the Player's Handbook. In the Player's Handbook, the font is just really too small, which makes it seem clustered, and the information is just given to you in horrible paragraphs. In Level Up, the font is a little bit bigger, things are spaced out, and most of the time information is presented in bullet points, and it's very clear to see where a new topic begins and where the subtopics are. Despite it being over 600 pages, it is somewhat of an easier read. However, there are more than a few grammatical errors and just things that could have used another look through. The most obvious ones are sentences that repeat a couple words right after. Like you would have like a blah 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 blah, and then it would say something like then the type of deals. And that actually happens quite a few number of times throughout this book, which is unfortunate. I found some of the information to also be contradictory, such as fatigue in the combat chapter and then in the appendix, where it's not very clear if it's a typo or something that wasn't explained very well, or maybe something that I might have missed. For this, I'm still going to give a success. It is a huge improvement over the Player's Handbook. Content. At its heart, this is the Player's Handbook. You're not going to find any information for the GM here. This is what you'd give to your players and hope they read through in all of its intricacies. Does it have everything you need as a player to start playing 5th edition, Level Up? Yes. And that's why this also gets a success. So who is this book for? Level Up is for the players who have experience with 5th edition and want something more. Let's be honest, in this day and age, if you're not modding your 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons game with supplements or homebrews, you're probably playing it wrong. That was a joke, by the way. But the point still remains. there are so many supplements and unofficial mods that change some aspect of the 5e engine, and this is one of them. Would I call it advanced? No, but it's just got more stuff and things to explain how to use those things. But for marketing purposes, having it called Level Up More Things for Your Things just doesn't really sound good. If you play with people who want a little more crunch in your 5e games, then this should be welcomed. If you play with people who want more customization for your character, whether it be their heritage, culture, classes, or whatnot, this too hits all of those points. If you've tried 5e but have never really liked it because of its flaws or for whatever reason, then this is going to be a hard sell. Would I play this with my group? Well, that really does depend on the people that I would play it with. If I know that they are looking for more crunch, more options, and slightly more tactically aware combat, like in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, then yes. If they are just looking to have adventures and a good time and a good story, then it's probably better to stick with something that they already have and already know. That's it for this review. Please feel free to leave a comment down below. Give this video a huge thumbs up to support this series and subscribe if you would like to see more. I will see you guys in the next video.